Welcome to another episode of the Saturday Morning Snap Fantasy Football Podcast, the show that brings you weekly advice and news at the beginning of every weekend. Introducing first your hosts, Mac, Mark, and Landon. We are finally back for good. Welcome into the Saturday Morning Snap Fantasy Football Podcast. It is episode 41. We are live on Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, Spotify, Stitcher, and Google Podcasts. If you've listened to us before, we want to say welcome back. And if you're new to the show, welcome in. We're glad to have you. If you've been listening to us for a while, it'd be great if you could leave us a review. We'd love to hear from you. And if you are a new listener and you like what you hear, go on and hit that subscribe button. Will come into your pocket every so often in the off season here. It's Sunday, February 24th. We are a little bit behind with our recording schedule, but nonetheless, we are back, and I'm joined with my two very, very special co-hosts, Landon and Mark. Boys, it's been a minute. But what's been going on? How you feeling? Hyped up for 2019 fantasy football?
Heyo!
Yeah! We're back! And we're hyped up.
I am jacked for fantasy football. I know it's the off season and it's cold. It might be cold where you are. It's rainy. I don't know. You're not watching football on Sunday, but either way, I am pumped. Marky, how you doing, my man?
Good. It's a bit of a Lambeau Field day up here in Thunder Bay. It's snowy. It's nice. It's Sunday. It's the day of relaxation. Truly.
Yeah.
Not stressed.
Mac, are you getting in?
You're obviously
in the
not a Packers
mood?
fan. I am getting into the fantasy mood. Combine's coming up, so I'm excited for that. Thinking a little bit more dynasty. Kind of shifted from redraft to dynasty, which is nice. Trying to get some trades going in our dynasty league, but no takers so far. Yeah,
no takers so far. Behind the scenes work. Yeah, me too, man. I think this year I'm seeing a lot of trade talk online and on Twitter. That's kind of what everyone's talking about, is the value of certain players, the value of first round picks. Right now I'm not valuing later first round picks very high. If you could get a value, a proven wide receiver, a good running back with a workload for a late first round pick, at this point I would absolutely do it. So we'll talk about that a lot later. We'll get into some of the prospects coming up in later episodes. But either way, I am jacked to talk to you fine gentlemen about football.
I certainly did miss you guys. It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a minute, man. You know, it's Landon and I get the luxury of hanging out from time to time on opposite ends of the GTA. Sorry, Mark, we've been seeing each other. Thought you should know.
Well, whatever, I guess.
Yeah, but poor Mark, all the way up in Thunder Bay, isolated, stuck in Lambeau Field.
Just because I'm
2,000
approximate kilometers away.
Yes.
It doesn't mean that we can't communicate and all, hang out. Just as a crew.
And that's why we're here.
Beautiful.
So we've got, this is episode 41, I would say the first real episode of the off season. And we're covering the reality of fantasy wide receivers in 2018. What really happened? How did they finish 1 through 12? The wide receiver ones. And we're going to break down the first half of the season, the second half of the fantasy season, and then go into the playoff weeks. Hopefully for you, it's weeks 14 through 16. So we're going to have sort of rankings and talk about consistency for the top 12 guys in the first half, second half, and playoffs. And hopefully that gives you a little bit of insight as to what really happened in 2018. You can get a little bit of perspective moving forward.
Yeah, you've done a lot of work on this, Mac. I'm impressed with what you've done. And so I want you to take the lead on these guys. And Marky and I will kind of give our maybe our opinion and our reaction is going to be similar to the listeners, and we'll be able to ask and discuss what these guys meant to our personal fantasy teams, kind of going forward.
With pleasure. I will. I'll post this graphic on our Instagram, which is Saturday Morning Snap, and you can get us on Twitter. I'll post it there too. Main account is SMS_fantasy, and then you can catch Landon at Landon_SMS and Mark at MarkDraft_SMS. So I'll put this graphic up, and you guys can sort of, if you're listening, we'll give you a quick moment to jump over there and take a look at it.
Number 1.
If you look at weeks 1 through 16, so you omit week 17, and it's a half-point scoring format, your number 1 wide receiver in 2018 who played all 15 games was Davante Adams from the Green Bay Packers. Consistency rank of 2 over the year. So pretty amazing. Good to note. Who do you think the number 1 most consistent wide receiver in 2018 was? He's actually not in the top 12.
Most consistent
wide receiver in 2018 by consistency ranking, meaning he didn't bust once.
Not in the top 12?
Not in the top 12.
Maybe
wow,
like
that's tough. Oh, I think I know, but I think I cheated. I think I saw the name.
He had a fantastic playoffs.
Brandon Cooks?
I know who it is.
Who is it?
Julian Edelman.
It is Julian Edelman, yeah. So, he would be in that top 12 range if he didn't have to sit out the first couple games of the season. So, that's why he's not in here. But Davante Adams is your most consistent wide receiver within the top 12. And number 2, finished number 1 overall. When you break down his season, weeks 1 through 7, just over 19 points per game. That was 5th among wide receivers in that stretch. He had 2 100-yard games. You see pretty much the exact same thing weeks 8 through 13, 17.5 points per game. That's second best in that stretch, and 3 100-yard games. And in the playoffs, 18 points a game, 6th overall in the playoffs. I mean, this guy was just super, super consistent. And if, I might be a little bit biased in saying this, but I think that those numbers we could see like a tiny bit of a bump on those numbers. Like, I think he is uber safe in 2019 with Matt LaFleur coming in, Aaron Rodgers a little bit re-energized, ready to get the offense clicking again. I think Davante Adams could be number 1 again next year. What do you guys think?
Well, let's hear it from a non-biased Packers adversary, Landon.
Yeah.
What's your take as a Vikings fan?
As a Vikings fan, I'm still excited for Stephon Diggs. People are even though Thielen it gets disrespected every single offseason, I think Adam Thielen and Stephon Diggs could be the 1A 1B. Thielen was a tough one. He started the year as the most consistent, had so many 100-yard games, and he kind of fell off late in the season. He really hurt a lot of people in the playoffs, and people tend to remember that. They look at the athleticism of Stephon Diggs, and he kind of went the other way late in the season. He had a lot of really good games, a lot of touchdowns late in the season, so I think he might get drafted ahead of Thielen again, maybe right around that same mark. I would say in the early third round, they might go. But my favorite wide receiver this year, and I'm kind of torn between 2 of them. I'm looking at DeAndre Hopkins as the number 1 wide receiver. He played really well. He's as consensus right now, he is going the first wide receiver off the board since the turmoil of Antonio Brown is currently going on. I think honestly for me it's between him, Odell Beckham, and Michael Thomas. And I think it's closer between him and Odell Beckham Jr. for the number 1 slot. I know, and we'll talk about that later, Odell Beckham did not finish in the top 12. He had a tough year, but I still think he's the most gifted and athletic wide receiver right now. So for me, it's between those 2 guys.
But it wasn't a matter of his athleticism or talent that let him down. It's not like he had a bad stretch of games. He was injured, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So you don't think Davante Adams can continue as the number one wide receiver next year?
I think he's very safe. I think he's very consistent. I think that's the key word is consistent. It's just those boom games with Aaron Jones coming on really strong. I think and there's always that possibility that Antonio Brown could go to the Packers. I know you would be thrilled at that. What if that happened? That would be insane. We'd have 2 top 12 wide receivers, but I think they would both be now further down on the top 12 list.
Yeah, they wouldn't finish 1 and 2. It's just not the realm of possibilities. I don't think he'll go to the Packers.
Yeah, I know.
To be honest, but yeah, in a dream world, I mean, if you look in this top 12, Antonio Brown at 2, spoiler, Juju Smith-Schuster at 8. So there is a world where they can live in the top 12 together, and you'll probably see that. But same thing with Thielen and Diggs; they're both there too. So it's sustainable. It's just not going to be a 1-2 split.
Right.
And if it is, Packers are winning a Super Bowl.
They need to get some defense helping them out too, though.
Yeah, but so what I'm saying though is like Davante Adams, if you had the choice between him or DeAndre Hopkins as first wide receiver off the board, you're not going to fault somebody for taking Davante Adams over him, because there's just not too many reasons to sort of fight against it.
No, you're right. And they both have a lot of upside. I think Hopkins has a little bit of a higher upside, and that's just personal opinion. That's all that is. It's hard to say that his upside is limited because of Aaron Rodgers. It's really not. But I think that's where the fantasy community is going. Mark, who's your number one wide receiver coming into 2019?
I think it's hard to overlook, like you said, the consistency of Michael Thomas. I loved Michael Thomas this year, and he is probably the hardest receiver in football to guard. He's just he's a marvel to watch.
His catch rate was unbelievable.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I love him for a number 1, and I think Davante Adams will stay in the top 3, but I think Hopkins is going to be floating right there with him. So I'm saying it, Thomas, Adams, Hopkins, and I really got high hopes for Smith-Schuster too. I think he's an obvious candidate for, now that he's got the wide receiver 1 position in Pittsburgh. He's going to be doing more of what he's already done, except with less Antonio Brown interference. Which
is this crazy to say though? If Antonio Brown goes to a destination that is not favorable, is it crazy to think that you would take Juju Smith-Schuster over Antonio Brown?
No, absolutely not.
I don't think it is. I don't think it is at all. Like I think that is very, very plausible.
It's interesting. I guess kind of also it depends like on whether it's a dynasty format. I think in the long run, Juju is just he's only begin to reveal what he's going to be capable of throughout his career. Antonio Brown is well established. He's 30 years old and still, as many would consider, the best receiver in football. But Smith-Schuster also just wowed audiences.
He's like 22, man.
Yeah. So I'm really curious to see what the Pittsburgh offense does with him, but I think Juju is going to be in the top 5.
Mm-hmm. I like that.
Number 2.
Number 2, Antonio Brown from the Pittsburgh Steelers. Landon, we're going to let you take the news on this one in a minute, but Antonio Brown, again, super safe, 6th in consistency rank. First half of the season, he was ranked 11th, just inside the top 12 at 17.3 points per game, 2 100-yard games, and then followed that up second half with another 2 100-yard games. The number 1 fantasy wide receiver in the second half of the regular season at 18.5 points per game. And in the playoffs, he was the third best wide receiver, just under 19 points per game. So Antonio Brown really gave you all that you asked for. He lived up to what you paid for him, and most likely you did really well if you had him on your team. But tell us what's been going on with Antonio Brown. What is the current news or status on him? Where's he going, or is he staying a Steeler?
So the short of it is that the Steelers have agreed to trade him. He posted on social media a long time ago saying his goodbye to Steeler Nation and the city of Pittsburgh and his teammates, and that was goodbye before the organization agreed to trade him. They still have the rights. He's still an owned man in Pittsburgh, but now he has met with the owner. He's met with Rooney. He wasn't willing to do that before, but I think they've kind of hashed things out. It's amazing these days how social media impacts these players so much. And we've heard that the Steelers will not trade him within the division. They're not gonna trade him to any
They're not going to trade him to the Browns. They're not going to trade him to the Ravens, right?
No, not going to trade him to New England, to the Patriots. So it's going to be out of division, and word on the street is that it's going to be a 3rd round pick, which is low. I would say that's extremely low for the value of the best wide receiver in the game. So
I would too.
At that price, everyone's pretty much open, I would say. But it's the fact that the NFL owners just covet and value those picks so heavily, despite the fact of the bust rate for even 1st round picks. It's amazing that people aren't willing to, or owners and managers aren't willing to give up that kind of capital for a guy for, say, a 2 to 3 year rental. Or 2 to 3
sometimes
years.
Sometimes it's more than that, though. It's cap space. It's not having a drama queen or a diva on your roster, right? Like, so sometimes it's a little bit more than that. But part of me thinks, like, what is going on in Pittsburgh if Le'Veon Bell doesn't want to play there and Antonio Brown, wants out to the point of like forcibly asking to be removed from the team? Is there something going on? Or are these two just exceptions to the culture? I don't know.
Yeah, so Antonio Brown did mention that it's Big Ben has the owner's mentality. He has that mentality of a coach, of an owner, and he's the end all be all in Pittsburgh. And Antonio Brown has immense respect for Big Ben, and it's Big Ben that made him the best receiver in football. So he's got to thank his career on that man. But like you said, he's a drama. He's a big head. We had too many. The killer bees were too big, and these guys want to do it on their own. They want to prove to the world that it's not the scheme. It's not Big Ben that does it. It's their talent, and hopefully, I don't know if it's going to pay off for Antonio Brown. There's very few places that in my opinion, he could go and still be the number 1 receiver in football. Now,
I agree wholeheartedly.
I think odds favorite would be the San Francisco 49ers. They seem to
which
like
I think
each
would be
other.
a great spot. That's a great spot for him.
Garoppolo, hopefully back and healthy. It's hard to say after an injury like that. There might be a step back, and there might be some frustration there. But they've got a great offensive coordinator, great offensive mind. It should be a decent spot. I think the best fantasy output might be the Indianapolis Colts. You and I mentioned that behind closed doors, Mac, or off camera,
mic.
But off mic. But that would be a great spot. But there's the T.Y. Hilton effect. I know they're both very different wide receivers, but I don't love it as much with two good targets in the same spot. With it, obviously Andrew Luck had a great season this year. So that's kind of all we know about Antonio Brown. We're gonna keep up to date. I'm really excited. It's gonna be a hot topic all season long, or all off season, and where he's gonna go in drafts is gonna be a question. I don't know if he still had a great season. He had such a good year, like you just said, in the consistency rank. His film was great. He got tons of separation. He caught a ton of catchable balls, and all you got to do is get him the ball. And if you can do that, I think he's going to be just fine.
Mark, what do you think? Let's just say next year, Antonio Brown is a 49er. That's probably the most probable outcome for him. So would you rather take, if they're going back-to-back in drafts, would you rather take Antonio Brown as a 49er or Juju Smith-Schuster as a Steeler?
Ooh. I think good question. I think Antonio Brown still. He is not reliant on any kind of play type. He doesn't rely on big plays. He relies on tons of targets and catching pretty much like the majority of what's thrown at him, and no matter what. I think I really like Jimmy Garoppolo, and I like a lot of those weapons on San Francisco. And I think
there's no real one in San Francisco right now. Like, who would the one be? Dante Pettis?
Yeah, maybe. Yeah,
that he can be supplanted.
And then that combined with George Kittle, it just makes a really interesting offensive layout. So I still think Antonio Brown, but it's really close.
Lando, what do you think?
Yeah, I would love. Now that you mentioned that, Marky, and my first reaction, like just gut instinct, is just to take Juju. That the star has been born in Juju, and I think it's going to be good in Pittsburgh. But that offense is going to be much different without the two big heads there. So I would probably, you're right. For next season, non-dynasty, completely redraft, I'd probably still take AB. Mac, do you lean on the other side of the fence?
I think you're playing on hype in both situations. I mean, I know what I'm getting in Pittsburgh because we saw Juju Smith-Schuster perform without Antonio Brown and without Le'Veon Bell. Like, we saw James Conner and Juju as the one, and it was awesome. Like, the production is there. Big Ben looks great. But you'd be buying into a ton of hype with a young quarterback in Garoppolo, with McKinnon coming back, with George Kittle having an unbelievable year, and then you insert Antonio Brown into the mix. Like, the hype train is moving really, really fast through San Fran right there. So
100%.
I think you'd be buying into the hype a ton because Juju's going to be really good in that system in Pittsburgh. So I don't know. I'm not sure where I would lean. I'd probably just go with the value. You know how I draft. But if I had to make a choice between the two, I think I'm going to go Juju, man.
Yeah. So do you think Roger Goodell is going to go to the owners, Rooney and whomever, and is going to be like, you know what? For the sake of ratings, please trade on draft day. We need the ratings. We want this to happen. That would be phenomenal. And it takes two to tango. It's got to be the other team. If the Steelers know that AB wants to go to San Francisco and they're just going to be, they can trade him to whoever they want. They can trade him to Buffalo. It's going to be, and it's not up to Antonio Brown in that point. So it's,
no.
Who knows? I know, sure, maybe they might trade.
We know it's not the Patriots. That's the one thing they've said.
This is true. So it'll be interesting to see. Anyway, I can't wait to see what happens. I think I think he'll fetch you know what? I'm thinking he's going to fetch a first-round pick in the end.
Number 3.
Tyreek Hill, wide receiver for the Kansas City Chiefs, at this moment in time was the third best wide receiver in 2018. And this is, I think that he's a perfect example of why we talk about consistency rank, because if you think about Tyreek Hill, third best wide receiver, absolutely dominant in some games, won you weeks single-handedly, 40 points here and there. First half of the season, second wide receiver. Second half, fifth wide receiver, both at about the 18.5 point per game total, 4 100-yard games, 2 per half. Into the playoffs, he wasn't as great, only 12 points per game. That was the 18th best wide receiver in that stretch. But you think about him, he's amazing. Consistency rank of 34th. So he is, and just like he was last year, this year he was very boom or bust. As good as he was, he had those disappearing acts. He had those games where he busted. And that was nothing new, and that was a gamble that you knew when you took Tyreek Hill on your team. But when he gives you 4 or 5 points on any given week, but then the next week he comes back with 40, that's just the game you play with Tyreek Hill. So, I know that you guys have said that DeAndre Hopkins and Michael Thomas would be guys that you would definitely take probably before Tyreek Hill, but is there anybody else above Tyreek Hill that you would consider ahead of him just for consistency?
I I would consider Julio. This might be the last year that I might consider Julio. But I
What
would
about
be
Odell Beckham
surprised.
Jr.?
Yep, 100%. Sorry, I thought you mentioned OBJ. I would definitely take Odell Beckham before Tyreek Hill. I could see some new gamers on fantasy football taking Tyreek Hill as the first wide receiver off the board because they love the Pat Mahomes. They've heard about him. They just know that Kansas City offense. I could see him going number one. I would not. And basically, that consistency rank is so important to Tyreek Hill's production. Yeah, he'll have weeks where he'll single-handedly win you the week with the 40-point outputs on a handful of plays, but I would definitely take Odell Beckham before Tyreek. What about you, Marky?
That's a really spot-on pick, would be Odell Beckham. And just like you said, Julio Jones. Like, Julio Jones very quietly led the league in yards for a long time in 2018, and then Tyreek Hill, like you can see in the consensus ranking, that Tyreek Hill does not even come close. But that's kind of a lot of his allure too, is the wild card element, the magic that he can bring to the field, and then it just makes any kind of lower week just seem like nightmarish for fantasy owners. But yeah, in that regard, I think Odell Beckham still would get picked before Tyreek. Tyreek is going to go in the top 5 receivers off the board. But as far as consistency wise, it's he's no Julio. I don't think. Week in, week out, Odell Beckham. I put more faith in them than Tyreek.
Number 4.
Number 4 on our list is DeAndre Hopkins, who you're both very high on. You would definitely take maybe as the first overall wide receiver in 2019. So he was great, had a consistency rank of 4, which is third best to Davante Adams and Julio Jones on this list. So, right up there, 4th best wide receiver in the first half, 10th best in the second half, number 1 fantasy wide receiver in the playoff weeks 14 through 16. So he was a potential league winner if you had him in the playoffs, 4 100-yard games on the season. It's crazy to think that this is not the ceiling for DeAndre Hopkins.
And I think that playoff rank really sticks with people. We'll talk
Absolutely.
about like the Tyreek Hill. He finished 18th in the playoffs, 11.9 points per game, and that might hurt his fantasy stock. I think it's going to hurt a couple guys more down the list a little bit more, but people remember that, and I think that's why he's going number 1.
Mm-hmm. Just for reference here, the way too early 2019 ADP ranks from Fantasy Football Calculator currently have DeAndre Hopkins as the number 1 wide receiver off the board at the 107. And then Davante Adams right behind, and then Julio Jones, actually. So, Juju Smith-Schuster currently at the 205. And it's very interesting to see where some of these guys fall. Tyreek Hill, 206. So he's behind. Antonio Brown, I'm going to have to keep scrolling for him. He's basically fallen off the map.
Yeah, well, that's going to change a lot.
Oh, absolutely. But anyways, just a little nugget there for you. But coming in at number 5, what are you going to say? Sorry?
I'm just bringing this up too now. I'm interested in this as well.
Yeah, so DeAndre Hopkins finished 4th, could potentially be number 1 in 2019 for average draft position. I'm not sure that I would take him number 1. I think I would still go Davante Adams. But again, you're going to have that choice if you're in the 7th, 8th, overall pick. So I would make a case for Davante Adams on pure consistency, but the ceiling is considerably higher with DeAndre Hopkins. I think most people would say. And the one thing I'll say about that is, what if Le'Veon Bell becomes a Texan? Does that affect DeAndre Hopkins' potential? Because Le'Veon Bell is going to get that ball a lot. And I know we're talking what ifs here, but what if?
I think what we saw, that the problem for me is that I don't think Deshaun Watson can sustain what Big Ben did, because that's going to be the comparison. Is that Big Ben? Yeah, he got Le'Veon Bell as the best running back, and he got Antonio Brown as the best wide receiver. But Deshaun Watson can't do that, in my opinion. He doesn't throw enough. He doesn't provide the reliable targets that Big Ben did. It's in his realm of possibility in a world potentially, but what we saw from him, I don't think it's possible. So I think it's great. It's still fine for both guys. I just and it would be exciting for Lev Bell. It's a great landing spot for him, but it would be tough for me to take them. It'll be hard for me to rank them outside the top 3 in both positions, but in the end, I would want to diversify if I had either guys on my team.
Yeah. No, hey, I get it. I totally get it.
Number 5.
Coming in at number 5, Michael Thomas from the New Orleans Saints. He was the 11th most consistent wide receiver, 10th in the first half of the season, 17.6 points per game, 2 100-yard games. Second half, he was the 4th best at 16 points per game, 1 100-yard game. So you didn't really get the big 100-plus games from Mike, but what you did get was a lot of receptions. He was the 11th best in the fantasy playoffs at 15.5 points per game. So Michael Thomas gave you a ton. He was a half point and definitely a full point monster with how many balls he caught and his catch rating. What was it? What did he finish on the season? Like almost 90%?
I think over that, yeah.
Yeah. So guy was great, hands down. I thought that he would be a little bit better than 11th in consistency, but and certainly 5th overall. But when you look at his season, just didn't have the touchdowns that he had in previous seasons.
Well, and there's so many other Saints players that found pay dirt too. That's another reason for their success, is that there are so many people getting in the end zone for that team.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. But 125 receptions on the season is it's bananas. So
yeah, Mark,
the volume's there.
About Michael Thomas too. You have him ranked at one of your top guys, maybe your number one guy. And Mac, you could finish your thought, but I want Mark to talk about why you would have him as your potential number one wide receiver.
I just think when all the cylinders are firing in that offense, he still gets a ton of action. He really showed that, in the third down situations in the playoff games. I really thought that was a team that deserved to go to the Super Bowl, and he was a huge reason for that. He was, for the first half of the season, especially when Ingram was out, while Kamara was playing remarkable football this year, everyone was talking about Michael Thomas. He pulls in virtually everything thrown his way. He's strong and he's big. He's just got such a presence on the field where I think, he's just, the fact that he doesn't get into the end zone all that often, but still hauls in this many points per game. It's just the proof is in the pudding for that guy.
I agree.
I'm looking at, he was the number one wide receiver to start the season. He started such on fire. Now, granted, they played Tampa Bay, Cleveland, and Atlanta, but then, those games, like the New York Giants, where he absolutely should have just ate, he fell off. He had only 4 receptions. He had a couple of huge games, one against the Rams and one against Cincinnati, where he also went off. But then the following week, he had a pretty good game, but he would have hurt you with those 5.8 games, the 6-point games, and
the NFC Championship game. People are all over him, tweeting at him 4 for 37. Yeah. Where were you?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I mean, that happens with everyone. That happens with Antonio Brown in Pittsburgh. It happens. It would have been.
That's Tyreek Hill every 4 weeks.
This is true. But,
or every other week if you go back to 2017.
I think the window for Michael Thomas is 2 more years once Drew Brees still maintains that some pretty elite status, not as a volume passer anymore, but just really able to get him the ball. I'm interested to see what New Orleans does once Drew Brees leaves and Michael Thomas is still that number one guy.
Yeah, so I mean, I'll speak for myself here, but I think the guys in the top 5, Adams, Brown, Hopkins, Thomas, I think depending where Antonio Brown goes, it might affect that, but I think there's a good chance he stays in the top 5. For me, Tyreek Hill would be out. I would draft Julio Jones ahead of him. I would draft Keenan Allen ahead of him, and I would probably draft Odell Beckham Jr. ahead of Tyreek Hill for next season, just due to the fact that he is very boom or bust, and I like consistency, but Patrick Mahomes will probably not have the same season in 2019 that he did this season. It's so hard to replicate something that is so polarizing. Like, it's just unbelievable how good of a season he had. So for him to follow that up with the same or better is probably highly unlikely. So that's why I would say probably Tyreek Hill is going to be outside of my top 5-6 players for next season.
Number 6.
But coming in at number 6, Adam Thielen, Minnesota Vikings, Landon's boy. He was consistency rank of 5, so super solid. Obviously the number 1 wide receiver over the first half of the fantasy season at 21 points per game, 7 straight weeks of 100 yards. It was 8 weeks, but in weeks 1 through 7, every single game was over 100 yards. His 8th week was also a 100-yard game. But he was just inside the wide receiver 1 category for weeks 8 through 13. Really, really hard to keep up with that pacing of 100 yards games every single week. But where he really let people down, and I think where he had sort of set this bar for himself, the expectations were really high, and how could they not be with that regular fantasy season? But 8 points per game in the playoffs, that is the 38th wide receiver in weeks 14 through 16. So Adam Thielen really let you down in the playoffs. And if you were counting on one of those 100-yard games plus a score to sort of carry you to a victory, you definitely didn't get it. So, what happened there? Is it that's just football and you get tape on a guy and it's easy to game plan against him, or did the magic just run out? What did happen in the playoffs for Adam Thielen?
I think
Mark, what's your opinion? Yeah, start with Marky.
I think the Vikings later in the season remembered that they're a running team, and they kind of picked up their socks in a big way on the ground, whereas they were such a clear passing threat at the start of the season, and that was an unsustainable run for Adam Thielen. But again, that team had a mixed bag this year. They had a new quarterback that was supposed to fill the shoes of a great season from a mediocre quarterback, so it was a really hard team to read when things didn't just fall into place immediately for them. So now it's like you look at the playoff ranking of Adam Thielen at 38th, and I think that's explained by just a bit of like a mixed bag in Minnesota.
Also the reemergence of Dalvin Cook too, right?
That's exactly it.
Mark, you took the words right out of my mouth. I was going to completely go that way, and I think people are torn what the Minnesota Vikings are going to do. Where to take Dalvin Cook, where to take both receivers, Kirk Cousins. Are they going to ask him to throw the ball? They're going to have a new, or they're going to keep their offensive coordinator from late in the season, which helped Dalvin but hurt Thielen. So it's going to be an interesting situation. I think Thielen might be a little bit of a value this year because people really aren't sure, and they're going to take kind of long shots before him. So it'll be interesting. I think he's going to be a value again this year. Yeah, his hands are so good and soft. He catches everything that gets thrown his way, really.
Number 7.
If we move down the list one spot, You got Julio Jones, who was the third most consistent wide receiver. Julio touchdown Jones. I'll be the first person to say that I was wrong about Julio Jones this year. I predicted that this was the beginning of the end for him.
Yep.
And he really showed us like flashes of 2014, 2015 Julio, where he was catching, in the neighborhood of 110 balls. It's certainly not 2015 when he caught 136, but finished with 113 receptions on 170 targets. And the thing that jumped out to me, he had 8 100-yard games, one behind Adam Thielen, but had 8 touchdowns. And just to sort of give you some perspective, 8 touchdowns this season. The last 2 seasons combined, 9. 3 touchdowns in 2017, 6 in 2016. So his touchdown numbers jumped up through the roof, which is something that you didn't anticipate. I didn't, at least. But Julio Jones, nearly like 100 yards on a weekly basis, plus the 8 touchdowns.
He had a hard time finding the end zone in the first half of the season, though, too. And you really
Correct.
saw
Zero.
like a complete increase from his game.
But I mean, that's what you figured you were getting, right? Like you were like, oh yeah, here comes Julio, 120 yards and no touchdown. But like you just knew that that's what it was.
Just looking at the numbers across the board, you don't see increase in the way that you see Julio Jones increase throughout the season. What was a pretty abysmal season in Atlanta, Julio Jones did stay afloat with some great numbers.
And he got better and better as the season went on. And sort of to your point, Mark, like the touchdowns came late in the season. It was one a week for the last 6 or 7 weeks. So
It's amazing.
Ninth overall receiver in the first half of the season with 4 100-yard games, another 4 100-yard games in the second half of the season, goes down 1 spot to the 8th best fantasy wide receiver, and then in the playoffs goes to number 5. So he just continued to get better. 9, 8, 5 as the year went on. So if you had Julio, you are through the roof impressed with what he gave you this year. I don't think it's going to happen next year. I know it's hard to say that, but it's got to end. It's got to end somewhere, man. And Devonta Freeman's coming back. Matt Ryan's getting a little bit older. Julio's getting a little bit older. Calvin Ridley is in Atlanta, undeniably. I don't know. It's just going to be really hard for him to put up 8 touchdowns or 1,600 yards receiving. I don't see it.
Now, I brought this up last season, and I mean, guys that win, wide receivers in particular, that win with size and speed, that get older and that hit that really close to 30 mark, they nosedive generally in productivity. Julio Jones is Mr. Questionable tag beside his name, yet he always seems to play, and I am blown away with the season he had. I tend to agree, Mac. I had him falling. I brought this up early last offseason as well. And I don't know if the fall is coming this season. I will still take Julio. I'm pretty confident taking him in the top 6 wide receivers this year. People were super down on him this year and got him at a value and probably won championships if they got past that week 13 against Baltimore. But he's still gonna go fairly high. People still like that name. They're gonna take him before the Robert Woods of the world and the Brandon Cooks and T.Y. Hiltons. But
here's the thing. If you reference, again, way too early ADP for 2019, but Fantasy Football Calculator has Julio Jones at the 9th overall spot, ahead of Michael Thomas, Odell Beckham Jr., Mike Evans, Juju Smith-Schuster, Tyreek Hill, Keenan Allen, Antonio Brown. Like these, I would take any of those guys over Julio Jones.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see where he ends up for sure. There's a few guys in there like that. The Keenan Allen is very close to me. I really like Keenan Allen. I think this year they have a point to prove and to finish in the playoffs. They got embarrassed by the Patriots this season, and I think they're going to be a team on fire. I think the time the timeline.
They're just not a playoff team.
And they're getting known for that now. Phillip Rivers, I think, has a couple really good seasons left in him, and I think it's going to be. I think they're set up for a pretty good 2019 season. I think Keenan Allen's going to benefit pretty substantially from that.
Yeah, it'll be interesting. I felt this way about Julio last year, and he proved me completely wrong. I think this is the year that I'll actually be really, really accurate with Julio. And if I'm not, then shame on me.
There's always
there's just no there's no data that support like this. I feel like this was an outlier season compared to his last two, and it really came on the back of touchdown upside that just we hadn't seen for 2 seasons. So I'm just going to comfortably say there's a lot of guys that I would take ahead of Julio, but if Julio fell to me at the right spot, I would love to take him just for targets, receptions, and volume, right? Like yardage. But I don't think I'm going to get the same touchdown output that I got this year. So Julio Jones would have to fall to me in like the 3rd round, and it's just not going to happen. But that's where I would be comfortable taking him as my wide receiver 2.
I think for me, there's a world where the yardage goes down and the touchdowns stay high just because he's that big body. He might just start beating.
But they don't use him.
Guy.
They don't use him in the red zone.
It depends on how his body, what he does. I don't know. That's just me. But anyways, let's keep going.
Number 8.
So we've talked about this guy at length. Juju Smith-Schuster, number 8th overall wide receiver in 2018. This is the boy, the future of the Pittsburgh Steelers. Consistency rank of 7. Weeks 1 through 7, he was the 17th best wide receiver. 4 100-yard games. So, he had a really slow start. Started to pick it up a little bit in the absence of Antonio Brown. Was the 6th best wide receiver in the second half of the fantasy season. 2 100-yard games to go. And then had 17 points per game. 8th best wide receiver in the playoff weeks. So we saw some momentum with Juju in the end of the season. Really was great in the second half of the season and into the playoffs. So that momentum is going to carry forward. That's affecting his draft stock next year. So do you think he belongs where he's being projected to be drafted? I mean, if you look right now, Fantasy Football Calculator, Juju Smith-Schuster, the 16th player off the board at the 205, ahead of guys like Tyreek Hill, Keenan Allen, T.Y. Hilton, Adam Thielen, guys that are all on this list ahead of him. So do you think he belongs in this category? I know we've talked about the potential, but do you think it's deserving?
I think mathematically, with Antonio Brown out of the picture, I think his numbers can only get better. But then again, that kind of makes the job of defenses a bit easier too. It's an interesting thing to think about. Juju it has ridiculous breakout speed, and it's just like what I love about him is the moves. Like he breaks ankles out there, and yeah, he's quite a talent, and especially one of the youngest talents in the league. So I think he is probably where he should be. I think he would be going in, like, I would think before Julio, just age wise. You look at, we talked earlier about how it might be a bit of a coin flip whether you would go with Antonio Brown in somewhere like San Fran or Pittsburgh, where he has a great connection with his quarterback. So yeah, it's interesting to think about. I think if Juju Smith-Schuster was still available on a draft board, and it was between him and, let's say, Mike Evans, I think Smith-Schuster all day.
Yeah, I agree with you. I think there is a very good chance he's top 5 next year. Like, we'll be a year from now, flash forward, we'll be talking about Juju Smith-Schuster in the top 5. 100%.
Number 9.
Yeah.
Let's go on. We talked a lot about Juju, so let's move to Robert Woods at the 9th spot. Consistency rank of 8. he was solid throughout the season, had a down stretch in his season. He was a wide receiver 1 in the first half of the season and in the playoffs. But second half of the season, he went down to the wide receiver 23, which is fringe wide receiver 2/3, and had no 100-yard games in the second half of the fantasy season, despite having 3 100-yard games in the first half of the season. So it's really funny for me to look at Robert Woods and think, man, Cooper Kupp went down in week 10, and that was sort of your opportunity to see an increased workload, and that was the low point of your season. So, what happened there where Robert Woods just kind of disappeared?
Robert Woods to me is going to get disrespected this year. He already early ADP. He's going in the 4th round. He's not.
That's crazy.
He's going to be the safest. He's going to be the best potential wide receiver 3 on your team you can have, and that is amazing if you could snag him there. His career stats are not, besides this year, are nothing to write home about. I think that's what people are going to go off of. No one has the warm and fuzzies about Robert Woods, and you're right. Now that Cooper Kupp is back, they're going to say Robert Woods is going to take a seat, even though he had a better season with him on the field. So yeah, I don't know. I think he's going to fall out. I also agree he's going to fall out of the top 12. I think he's still going to be that fringe wide receiver 1. He's going to have some great games. Still going to be a good offense. So I do like Robert Woods a lot, and I think he's going to be a great value at any point in the draft. Wherever you can take him, he's going to be good.
Yeah, certainly, and he certainly doesn't have that immediate draftable quality like so many of the names we've just talked about. Even just the fact that he is next to Juju on this list, I don't know what kind of person could even have predicted that, or I don't know. At least all of his accomplishments throughout the season were a lot less, shiny than some of these other names we've talked about.
Yeah, what's crazy for me here is you're going to have where Robert Woods is being drafted right now, and you said the 4th round. Yep. If I look at that ADP list, I see Robert Woods back-to-back with Aaron Rodgers. So Aaron Rodgers is second QB off the board. Patrick Mahomes going crazy high. I think if you pay up for Patrick Mahomes, you are probably overspending, because him doing that again is highly unlikely. But I'm just going to use this as an example. Why we always preach, take the quarterback late. You can get Drew Brees right now in the 8th pick of the 8th round, right? So we're talking 80, 90 player off the board. The difference between Aaron Rodgers and Drew Brees is 8 points. So last year, 8-point differential, but we're talking 6 rounds difference. Right? That's crazy. What Robert Woods is going to return to you in the 4th round is a steal of a deal. But the difference between a guy like Robert Woods in the 4th round, and I'm going to have to do just a little bit of digging here. Robert Woods had 177 points on the season. If we go over to Fantasy Football Calculator and we go down to where Drew Brees is being drafted and we find a similar wide receiver, that's going to be Mike Williams. Okay, so if I go and try to find Mike Williams right now, where he finished on the season, I'm going to be scrolling for a bit. 125 points. That's a 52-point differential. The value that Robert Woods is going to return in the 4th round versus taking Aaron Rodgers is monumental. So you always go ahead and you take those wide receivers in the 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th round, and you get that quarterback later, because the difference between quarterback 1 and 2 and quarterback 10 is so small. But the difference between wide receivers in the 4th and the 8th round could be 40, 50 points. So take those QBs later and grab your Robert Woods in the 4th round and get the steal of the deal, get the most value you can.
And because the consensus, I feel, the feeling out there with fantasy gamers is that these early quarterbacks are safe, right? They're just so safe, right? But that's just, it's very misleading. And this year was a great year for late quarterbacks finishing in the top, like Matt Ryan, Big Ben, Andrew Luck, Jared Goff finishing pretty high. These guys, Dak Prescott even surprisingly finishing high. Phillip Rivers, who you've been a big fan of. These guys are top 10 guys, and they were drafted very late. And you're 100% right, Mac. I know we'll preach that all off season, and we should move on, but your analysis on this ADP was spot on.
Yeah, and like the numbers I just gave were for standard leagues. If you go into a half-point PPR, the discrepancy is even further. Mike Williams 144, Robert Woods 219. Now we're into the 80-point range. So it just the data speaks for itself, right? Like grab the guys with value. We got to round out the last three fairly quick here. We want to get into some analysis. It's going to be a longer episode today, but
Number 10.
Mike Evans, 10th best wide receiver in 2018, consistency rank of 20. And that's funny when you think about the season that Tampa Bay had. They were so electric at times, competing in shootouts with teams they had no business playing with. But it's funny how Mike Evans sees the 20th consistency rank. So fringe wide receiver 1 in the first half of the season. Again, fringe wide receiver 1 in the second half. He had 3 100-yard games per half, so 6 on the fantasy season. And in the playoffs, just outside high wide receiver 2 at the 14th overall rank. So Mike Evans was consistently in the back end of the wide receiver 1 and the top end of the wide receiver 2 finishes. So what do you think about Mike Evans' season? What do you think he sort of projects moving forward to next year? Do you think that he has, again, top 10 upside, or do you think that he's going to be sort of pushed out of this wide receiver 1 category?
I think any Buccaneer on this list is going to be one of the more unreliable top 12 players. He's
interesting.
I mean, while Deshaun Jackson certainly showed out, he is now a free agent, and I guess that does put more work into Mike Evans' hands. But I just think the unreliability is due to the fact that there's a new head coach who loves running the ball, and then there's players like, Peyton Barber and hopefully more Ronald Jones. But that's just saying, like, we're talking about Bruce Arians in the past, which I know in Tampa Bay it's not going to be easy to maintain that sort of run first mind frame. But also you got to remember, like, OJ Howard's going to be back healthy. They found lots of success with younger receivers like Adam Humphries and Chris Godwin. So it's just maybe I think he has a less solid spot in this top 12, but I think Tampa Bay is just unpredictable and they haven't impressed enough to make me show that he like Mike Evans is this prototype. I think 20th consensus rank is accurate because they are
Consistency.
Inconsistent team.
So that's an interesting opinion from a Bucs fan, Marky, and I think that's a very fair analysis. I think he's going to be overdrafted. I think Mike Evans, the hype around that team with Bruce Arians is going to be very high. People will take him very early, and I tend to agree. I would prefer like a Chris Godwin late in the draft than take Mike Evans higher. I would prefer the Keenan Allens of the world to Mike Evans and Juju, obviously, and these guys that might get, and Adam Thielen, that might get disrespected a little bit. So I'll probably let people take Mike Evans again, like I did this year. It maybe hurt me a little bit. He had a lot of really good games, but he had some dud games and where he disappeared. And I don't know if he's the elite wide receiver that everyone really thinks he is. And yeah, I think that's spot on, Marky.
Number 11.
Jumping down to Keenan Allen at number 11, he had a consistency rank of 9. And Keenan Allen was prototypically exactly himself. 25th wide receiver in the first half of the season, third best wide receiver in the second half. And this is sort of exactly what we talked about midway through the season. I remember myself going on a bit of a rant as a Keenan Allen apologist saying, listen, he did this last year and he's going to do it again this year. He's going to be completely safe. He's going to win you weeks in the second half. And that came to fruition. 11.5 points per game in the first 7 weeks of the year. In the last 6, almost 20 a game at 19.8. Keenan Allen just finds a way to get it done second half of the season. So, just keep that in the back of your mind. If you're a Keenan owner next year and he has a slow start, just know that there's a really good chance that he's going to pick that up. But Keenan Allen really disappointed in the playoffs. And one thing I'm going to note, he's the 36th ranked, so wide receiver 3 in the playoffs. But let's not forget that he basically didn't play one of those games, went out early in the first quarter with an injury. So that hurt his numbers. But yes, he did let you down. And for me, he cost me a championship going down. So I don't know. I feel really good about Keenan Allen going into next year. What are your guys' thoughts? Do you project him going higher, or do you think that health and the risk of re-injury is just too high for you to comfortably take Keenan Allen where he's being drafted?
I love Keenan. I think he's going to finish in the top 6, 7 this year. I think he's moving up the board. I'm a huge fan. I'll take him high this year. Marky, what are you saying?
Me too. Certainly over a Mike Evans. But it's just a bit of shaky ground, I guess. And subjectively, having owned him, it's not worrisome because he is, he'll make owners kind of give their heads a shake and remind owners how good he is. But it hopefully is a little more consistent next year. I think like maybe eighth or something like that will be his finish next year.
Number 12.
Stephon Diggs is the last wide receiver in our top 12 for the Minnesota Vikings. Had a consistency rank of 12, so right on the cusp of a wide receiver 1/2. Had 4 100-yard games throughout the regular season. Funny enough, he was never a wide receiver 1 in terms of ranking in the first half, second half, or playoff ranks, but finished just inside the top 12. So he's sort of interesting. Playoffs really let you down. Dropped to about 10.5 points per game in that 14, 15, 16 week stretch, whereas he was averaging somewhere between 13.5 to 18.5 points in the regular season. So I know you like Stephon Diggs, Landon. I know that you're excited about him and the future and his potential. Is he inside this top 12 in 2019, or was this just a lucky year for him?
I don't have him inside the top 12. I don't think they can throw the ball enough. Minnesota's going to be a great team that they will do better this year than they did last year in standings. I think that they're obviously they'll find their stride. Cousins and Cook and everyone will be just fine, which gives you more opportunity for touchdowns, which helps Stephon Diggs. But I think there's just too many good players that just missed out on the top 12, like a Brandon Cooks, T.Y. Hilton, Odell Beckham Jr., Amari Cooper. A lot of guys that will overtake Stephon Diggs. I think he might be a little bit overdrafted next year, because people will just look at his final numbers and draft based on that, and I think that's just where,
that was going to be my point as well. Just too many guys outside the top 12 that didn't get put inside this category. Another one, Tyler Boyd, knocking on the door.
For sure.
Yeah. Something to note here, only 5 of the top 12 wide receivers were ranked as a wide receiver 1 in both the first, second halves of the season, plus the playoff week. So really you only had 5 of these wide receivers that were consistently solid number 1s. Even a guy like Adam Thielen, just if you note back, best in the first half of the season, 12th best in the second half, 38th best in the playoffs. So even a guy like Adam Thielen showed that he was vulnerable at times. Not as consistent, not as reliable as you wanted him to be. But those five guys, Davante Adams, Antonio Brown, DeAndre Hopkins, Michael Thomas, and Julio Jones. Those are your five ironclad fantasy studs of 2018. So if you had any of those guys, you were super, super safe, super happy.
So what do you want to talk about next? We kind of talked about players in the top 12 we think will fall out of the top 12. Who do you think is going to be a wide receiver 1 next year that finished as a wide receiver 2 this year?
So what wide receiver 2 will jump up to wide receiver 1 status next year?
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to go cliche answer here, but I'm going to say Odell Beckham Jr. He was top 10 in consistency. I know it is, but there's some interesting stuff here that people need to know. Odell Beckham Jr. was top 10 in consistency, but only finished 9 points behind Stephon Diggs at number 13, right? So he played 3 less games than Stephon Diggs, but finished 9 points behind. So right. It shows you how close he was with way less games, like a quarter of his fantasy season lost. 5 100-yard games, 6 touchdowns in 12 games, 1 touchdown every other game. I think he's going to be a lock for them next season. I think there's unless Eli Manning just loses his right arm, there's no way that Odell Beckham Jr. doesn't finish as a top 12 option wide receiver 1 next year. And I think any fantasy gamer listening to this podcast wouldn't disagree with me.
Absolutely. Marky, who's your guy?
I happen to like Juice Landry myself, Odell Beckham's draft mate. This is a team that we don't often talk about very much on this team, but they had an amazing season just as far as turning things around. Baker Mayfield is, as we've seen, a great player, and he is only going to get better. They've just gotten Kareem Hunt. I think that offense is really going to open up a ton now that they've got him, because Landry is I think he has a bit of that Odell Beckham kind of explosiveness and finding empty spots. So, yeah, here's my take, is that Landry's going to finish with 1,100 yards and 10 TDs this year.
Ooh, juicy.
Spicy.
I like it. So my guy that's an outside looking in is Amari Cooper. And that I know you might be tired of hearing the Amari Cooper story, but I think Dallas was a great landing spot for him. They showed the persistence to get him the ball. And I know he had disappearing acts too, but I think this offseason working with Dak finished actually as a really good quarterback, and I think he has the potential to do it again next year. And I think he is not by no means a lock, but he has the talent and potential, the opportunity to get him as a wide receiver 1. And I think the key is to getting Zeke the ball out of the backfield, passing him the ball, more passing plays for Dallas. Just not being that run first offense will open up the defenses, keep them more honest and having to and I think they do need to get another weapon there. I think that will also help Amari. And yeah, I think he has a good chance. He's still a young guy and should be good for next year.
Yeah, I love it. Do you want to jump into a quick Dailies question before we leave here, boys, or you want to cut her off?
Where I want to know your guys' best or most likely landing spot for Lev Bell this offseason.
Oh man,
I like this one.
I want the Texans. I really want him to go to the Texans. I'll be thrilled if that happens.
I wanted to say Texans. Right. I wanted to. No, that would be that would be deadly for him, and that offense, when all elements are healthy, they're a big time threat. And for me, I guess it's kind of, I don't know, dreaming to hope he would end up somewhere like Tampa Bay.
That would be a great spot.
As long as he doesn't,
a really good spot.
Well, I just don't want him to end up on an East Coast AFC team, anywhere but there. Let's just keep him away from there. Throw him somewhere, keep him out of that division.
You have a question here, Landon. You said that in your dynasty league, your team's quarterback situation sort of finished
This is mine,
a little bit better than
mine.
you. Oh, this is Mark's.
Yeah.
But you said that your quarterback situation finished a lot better than you sort of foresaw at the beginning of the season. You've got Russell Wilson, Mitchell Trubisky, and Lamar Jackson. You're wondering, which player do you trade of those three if you had to choose? Landon, I'll let you take it. Which one do you trade?
If you're going to trade one guy out of those, I'm probably going to trade, probably Mitchell Trubisky off that really good season. I did not expect him to do so well, but he performed really well, and they let him run a little bit. I think the biggest hype in Dynasty would be around him. I believe Lamar would be a close second, because I don't know if he could give the volume and throw the ball as much as we would like to see from him. And people still really like Lamar Jackson. Obviously, the news came out that Joe Flacco is out of Baltimore and is in Denver right now. He might have the most value. I do really like Lamar, and I see him being a fantasy darling with how much he runs the ball. So you probably could get the most trade value out of Lamar Jackson for a quarterback needy team. But for a guy that I have the least, I think Russ is going to be just fine. I love Russell Wilson. He had a down season from where we drafted him, finishing number 1 2 years ago. But I still like Russ. I think you can get really good value from both quarterbacks. Trubisky and Lamar Jackson.
If I had to take a gamble on both of those rookie quarterbacks, I would probably, after this season, take it on Trubisky. And I know Lamar was just handed the keys to the quarterback position, but you've just seen with guys like Lamar Jackson, his player build, the archetype that relies heavily on his feet, that goes away. Like, that is not something that is timeless. But what does last for a whole season is your ability to read coverage and make throws, and that's not Lamar Jackson's game. Now, that's not to say that he couldn't improve upon that and have that in future years, but I would rather take that gamble on Trubisky at this point than Lamar Jackson. And I think that Landon's right. You can get top value for Lamar Jackson because there's going to be some fantasy owner out there that sees the ceiling, sees the potential for Lamar Jackson. But you have to sell on that hope, right? You got to sell on that potential. You know Russell Wilson's going to be solid. You know Trubisky probably has a good chance to be solid going down the stretch of the next 4, 5, 6 years. I just don't hold the same hope for Lamar Jackson that I do for the other guys. So I would trade Lamar, get top dollar for him, and pick up maybe a rookie or a sophomore running back. Maybe pick up a guy like a Cortland Sutton that could be really, really solid in the coming years. But that's kind of where I'm at.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. Right now, looking at the draft prospects, there's no quarterback that stands out as the next Baker Mayfield or Lamar Jackson. To me, we're gonna look into more dynasty stuff going forward. DK Metcalf is getting a ton of buzz as a wide receiver. That's the next kind of Odell Beckham or Julio Jones type of guy. They're comparing themselves personally to Jarvis Landry and Odell Beckham, DK Metcalf, and AJ Brown out of Ole Miss. And it's exciting. We're going to look into that. Like Max said earlier, the combine is coming up. We will give our analysis of what guys kind of improved their draft stock dramatically, who's decreased it, and hopefully we'll get a good idea of some top prospects this next weekend.
I would like to answer your question about who the best wide receiver is in Dynasty right now. If you're starting up a Dynasty draft this off season,
Yeah, who's your number one guy in Dynasty for wide receiver?
So for
we had a
me,
wide receiver show.
I think we have to say consensus is between Odell Beckham Jr. and DeAndre Hopkins.
Sure.
I mean, Mark, do you agree with that?
That's consensus.
Okay.
Yeah.
So here's the point I'm going to make. I think a lot of people are going to probably say Odell Beckham Jr. just for star quality. But I think one thing you have to take into consideration is the quarterback of those two players. We don't know what's going to happen in New York. We don't know if they're going to try and trade for somebody. We don't know if they're going to draft somebody and go through those rookie woes and the learning curve. So I'm going to go and say that DeAndre Hopkins is going to be immensely more valuable than Odell Beckham Jr. in Dynasty right now because of the quarterback situation. We know that Deshaun Watson is most likely the future for this team for the next decade. And him and Hopkins having Watson for the rest of Hopkins' career means really, really great things. They can build chemistry. They don't have to go through the sort of trials and tribulations of a rookie quarterback coming into the league, learning a new system, getting comfortable with players. We already have that established. So Hopkins is crazy safe to me in Dynasty and definitely deserves the number one pick.
All right. My guy is Odell Beckham Jr. is my number one Dynasty wide receiver. I think
please talk me out of this.
I think that New York gets a rookie quarterback, but I think this rookie quarterback is going to know that Odell Beckham is his guy and going to be that number one going forward. I think Odell Beckham Jr. is just more talented than Hopkins. I know it's very close, but I still think Odell Beckham's that guy. He's younger. I think he's just my number one Dynasty wide receiver. If I was trading for a guy long term, I think Odell's still my wide receiver in Dynasty long term.
All right, Mark, settle the tie.
I don't know. I like both these guys a lot, but I'm gonna have to go with Hopkins.
Yeah, boy.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah. Well, I do really like the game plan down there, and I think Watson is a star and really relies on Hopkins. So, yeah.
There you go. Yeah. All right, guys, that's a wrap. We have a nice extra long episode coming back from an extended break. I can't wait to talk to you fine fellas this offseason more about rookies, about we're talking about quarterbacks, tight ends going forward, some consistency, and get things going, get the hype train back on the rails.
Yeah. We've talked about the reality of running backs and wide receivers for last season. We're going to do tight ends next. That is going to drop on March 9th. So in 2 weeks from now. Just a friendly reminder for you guys to jump over wherever you're listening, whether it's Spotify, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts. Go on and leave us a rating and a review. We would love to hear from you. We would like to make this listening experience the best for you. And so your feedback is very, very important to us. So go over there, leave us a rating, leave us a review. You can always send us an email at saturdaymorningsnap@gmail.com. And, hope to hear from you and, enjoy the off season as much as we are. So that'll do it for us today. And we'll see you in a couple weeks.
See ya.
Bye.
All right, boys. See ya. Bye. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Saturday Morning Snap Fantasy Football Podcast. Follow us on Twitter at SMS_fantasy. Support this independent podcast at patreon.com/SaturdayMorningSnap.